Tucked into a corner on Royal Street in New Orleans, Louisiana, is an unassuming but beautiful home. It is famously known as the Lalaurie House. Its architecture and structure fits perfectly in with the old Spanish influence of the city. No special lights hang from the balcony above, no special markings hang around anywhere, but if you're looking for it, you will find it. The reason for the fame of this structure is dark and sinister. It reminds us of the potential evil of people when they are given access to own one another, and the social influence for people to look the other way when there's obviously something awful going on. Louie and Delphine Lalaurie lived in this lavish mansion amongst their peers in New Orleans in the 1800s. They were respected members of society, threw beautiful parties, and had the ears of the creme de la creme of that era. What their peers didn't know was their shared interest in torture, human experimentation, and ultimately murder. Delphine's previous two husbands both died, but left her with daughters, and on June 25, 1825, Delphine married for the third time, a physician named Leonard Louis Nicholas Lalaurie, who was much younger than she. In 1831, she bought property at 1140 Royal Street, which she managed in her own name with little involvement from her husband, and in 1832 had built a 2-story mansion there, complete with attached slave quarters. She lived there with Louis and 2 of her daughters, and maintained a central and well-respected position in New Orleans society. There are conflicting accounts of Madame Lalaurie's treatment of her slaves between 1831 and 1834. Harriet Martineau, writing in 1838 and recounting tales told to her by New Orleans residents during her 1836 visit, claimed Lalaurie's slaves were observed to be, quote, singularly haggard and wretched. However, in public appearances, Lalaurie was seen to be generally polite to black people and caring of her slaves' health. Court records of the time show that Lalaurie set free 2 of her own slaves, Jean-Louis in 1819 and de Vince in 1832. Nevertheless, Martineau reported that public rumors about Lalaurie's mistreatment of her slaves were well known, and a local lawyer was dispatched to Royal Street to remind Lalaurie of the laws relevant to the upkeep of slaves. During his visit, the lawyer found no evidence of wrongdoing or mistreatment of slaves by their keepers. A well-known story that lends to the legend of the mansion and its supposed hauntings. One of the Lalaurie's neighbors saw one of the Lalaurie's slaves, a 12-year-old girl named Leah, fall or jump to her death from the roof of the Royal Street mansion while trying to avoid punishment from Delphine Lalaurie brandishing a whip. Leah had been brushing Delphine's hair when she hit a snag, causing Delphine to grab a whip and chase her to the roof. The body of the child was buried on the grounds of the mansion. This incident led to an investigation of the Lalauries, in which they were found guilty of illegal cruelty and forced to forfeit 9 slaves. These 9 slaves were then bought back by the Lalauries through the intermediary of one of their relatives and returned to the Royal Street residences. This instance shows the power and influence that the Lalauries had over their peers. There were also reported stories that Lalaurie kept her cook chained to the kitchen stove and beat her daughters when they attempted to feed the slaves. According to accounts of the time, the following were the events of April 10th, 1834. During yet another Lalaurie party this evening, a fire broke out in the kitchen. While that happened, the entire party made its way into the street. In true New Orleans fashion, nothing is to stop a party in full swing. The servers poured champagne for the well-to-do, and the food was still being consumed. All merriment simply relocated to a less dangerous position. When the police and fire marshals got there, they found a 70-year-old woman, the cook, chained to the stove by her ankle. She later confessed to them that she had set the fire as a suicide attempt for fear of her punishment being taken to the uppermost room, because she said that anyone who was taken there never came back. As reported in the New Orleans Bee of April 11, 1834, bystanders responding to the fire attempted to enter the slave quarters to ensure that everyone had been evacuated. Upon being refused the keys by the Lalauries, the bystanders broke down the doors to the slave quarters and found 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other, who claimed to have been imprisoned there for some months. Many other accounts said that when the firemen went upstairs to the apartment, the smell was overwhelmingly wretched. The Lalauries, without confession, we are not sure which or if both of them mutilated their slaves. Some had their eyes sewn shut. Others had their body parts removed and placed elsewhere on their bodies. There was a woman called the Spider Woman, and, with no detail, it is left to the imagination what kind of horror she endured. A man was stuck to the wall with his face dissected and pinned back to the wall. One man's genitals were removed, and a crude sexual reassignment surgery was imposed on him. And of course, as you would expect, all of these wounds were covered with maggots and flies. The majority of these horrors were put upon these poor people that most likely did not survive their injuries. Of course, this information was taken from witness accounts and reprinted in collections of stories by Henry Castellanos and George Washington Cable. When the discovery of the tortured slaves became widely known, a mob of local citizens attacked the Lalaurie residence and demolished and destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands. A sheriff and his officers were called upon to disperse the crowd, but by the time the mob left, the Royal Street property had sustained major damage, with scarcely anything remaining but the walls. Before you cheer for the mob, however, they too were guilty of horribly ignoring the rumors and witness accounts of mistreatment and cruelty. Also, once the tortured slaves were taken to a local jail, they were available for public viewing. The New Orleans Bee reported that by April 12th, up to 4,000 people had attended to callously view the tortured slaves to convince themselves of their suffering, but it most likely added to their sufferings a humiliation compounding their grief. Some of the slaves revealed that there were other graves beyond the one of Leah, the girl who fell to her death, and it was found other graves on the property of slaves who had died due to unknown causes. Years later, when workmen were remodeling the interior, they found the skeletons of other victims dumped in holes under sections of the mansion's floor, so Delphine and Louie wouldn't have to answer for their demise. In the legend of the Lalauries, Madame Delphine and Monsieur Louie escaped the mob during the madness of the fire during the party via carriage to the waterfront, thereby taking a boat to Mobile, Alabama, then sailing off to Paris, France, where they would live out the rest of their lives free from justice. The story of Monsieur Louis's death, though not substantiated in any way by official documentation, is that he perished during a wild hog hunt. Though we cannot say if they ever officially returned to New Orleans, it is rumored that Madame Delphine did return after the death of Louis. There is a grave in the St. Louis cemetery with an inscription on the old copper plate that reads in French, Madame Lalaurie, born Marie Delphine McCarthy, died in Paris on December 7, 1842. According to French archives of Paris, however, Marie Delphine McCarthy died on December 7, 1849. At this point, I honestly have to fully plagiarize Wikipedia. My apologies. I am not a New Orleans native, but I do have full respect for its rich history. The house remained ruined, at least until 1836, but at some point prior to 1888 it was, quote, unrecognizably restored, and over the following decades was used as a public high school, a conservatory of music, a tenement, a refuge for young delinquents, a bar, a furniture store, and a luxury apartment building. In April 2007, Nicolas Cage bought the Lalaurie House through Hancock Park Real Estate Company for a sum of $3.45 million. The mortgage documents were arranged in such a way that Cage's name did not appear on them. On November 13th, 2009, the property, then valued at $3.5 million, was listed for auction as a result of bank foreclosure and purchased by Regions Financial Corporation for $2.3 million. Today, the Lalaurie mansion is privately owned with no known tours available, though it still is, to this very day, an attraction of morbid curiosity and beauty. Its very name, still almost 200 years later, strikes fear and wonder into the hearts of all who hear the legend of Madame Delphine Lalaurie. Thanks again, guys, for watching and listening. This is only my second video, but I'm going through the list, and I figure that Madame Lalaurie would be very interesting to a lot of you. She's interesting to me, and she's actually considered her husband are considered one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. But who can say, right? Anyway, I want to say thanks for listening and for coming to see me. I will be producing videos weekly, and hopefully you'll come and see me again. Again, I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy the series that I'm doing right now. Eventually it's going to change, but right now I love my state very much. I know it sounds bizarre to some people, but I think that our area has a very full history, and if you ever get to come down and visit New Orleans and the bayous of Louisiana, I strongly recommend it. And go on as many tours as you can while you're here. They're amazing. But anyway, you guys have a great day, and I'll see you again.